Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 248, Second Manassas versus First Bull Run. Last week, we talked about who deserves to have the title of the savior of the Union at Gettysburg. We had an episode where we had the overall grouping of candidates, and then I had a shorter episode that kind of gave you my thought process on the matter. So hopefully you came up with maybe your choices, whether you agreed or disagreed with me. Again, I don't think there's necessarily a correct answer to that, but I think also since we did an entire month on Gettysburg, it was a good thought exercise to kind of go through and really think about, if we had to narrow it down to maybe a couple or maybe even one person, who that would be. This week, we're going to have a different type of episode. We need to return to Bull Run and talk a little bit about the two battles that happened there. Of course, before we do that, let's talk about some Patreon content. And as of the recording of this episode, we have a new episode that has been dropped. We're going back to a memoir review. This one's going to be 13 months in the Confederate Army. And like we have mentioned, maybe in past episodes, we're trying to do kind of a overarching view of memoirs and different kinds of memoirs and trying to cover all kind of corners of the war. This one is going to be a little bit different because it is covering an individual who was pressed into Confederate service, but the memoir itself is a little bit of a kind of propaganda piece, if you will, and you kind of realize that toward the end of the book. So it's a little bit different of a look of a memoir, entertaining though. So if that sounds like it would interest you, we have done other memoirs in the past. We have done scouts, we've done cavalrymen, artillerymen, we've done regular infantry, we've done kind of the top memoirs that you could think of if you think of your classic Civil War memoirs. We've done picture slideshows. We just did a picture slideshow for Gettysburg monuments here in our month of Gettysburg. We have done movie reviews. We're going to go back to a movie review here for our next Patreon episode. And it's going to be a deeper cut. So maybe it's one that you haven't seen yet. So hopefully, if that sounds like it would interest you, that is coming down the pike here. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there's a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So when you see the title of this episode, I think you might at first glance kind of brush it off. And I will kind of be honest, I did too when I first considered it. For one reason or another, you kind of had this idea that by the time you get to Second Manassas, the war is more in full swing perhaps. It is on compared to the dress rehearsal type battle that was First Bull Run. But when you really think about it, barely over a year separates the two engagements. The first is going to be the opening major encounter of the war that really does set the tone of what things are going to be like. As I mentioned a while back, when I redid the battle in a Redux episode, it is cliche to say, but it does really show that the war is going to last a lot longer than people previously had thought. When Second Manassas happens, it is going to be significant because it would be the second costliest battle of the entire war up until that point, second only to Shiloh, and thus the most significant fighting the East, the main theater, had seen, in my opinion, not to downplay the 7 days battles up until that point as well. But while they both have significance in the moment, they will be overshadowed. First Bull Run will be overshadowed by the long run of the war. Second Manassas is then overshadowed by Antietam, which happens very shortly afterward. But even so, I think it's important to take a look perhaps at both of them. In a couple of the sources I have seen, this is a subject that soldiers would wax on, especially if they served on the same ground. A member of the Iron Brigade would write specifically about the difference in the two battles. And here we have his quote. It was a different class of men. They had seen service. They had been in a number of hard battles. They had learned how to fight. The quote actually does go on to kind of highlight how Second Manassas is important because that is where the most threatening kind of action happens around Washington. And I think part of that is because this is where the Iron Brigade truly does cut their teeth in terms of a unit, as a brigade, right? And obviously, we need to have some kind of significance towards that action. So it could be a little bit of that in the writing. But obviously, I think it's debatable as to whether after Second Manassas, that's really the greatest time that Washington was threatened, or maybe even it was First Manassas, and we can even have that debate as well. Even if they did not fight at First Manassas, then they certainly had heard of that first battle, either as a huge disaster if you were a Union soldier, or if you were a Confederate, then it was a glorious victory. It must have been fairly strange to go over the same ground as the previous engagement, fighting another, larger battle that saw approximately 14,000 more casualties. Even going to the battlefield today, it is a little odd because some of the battlefield is shared, although to be fair, some of it is not. Oddly enough, the part that is shared, that is actually very important to the survival of the Union, is so fixated with the First Manassas battle, you hardly even think of it as a Second Manassas area. Obviously, if you've been listening to me long enough, you know that these two battles and this battlefield would be my first home battlefield, so to speak, so there is a special fascination when it comes to this particular area. So, with that in mind, with maybe a little bit of a different thought process in mind, I think it is worth perhaps compare and contrast to see what we find. We will start with the things that I will classify as non-factors. While significant to the campaigns, I'm not so sure that they should be included in necessarily deciding what to think of a First versus Second Manassas. They are both pretty big differences. Troop strength is quite different between 1861 and 1862. Now, you could be sitting there and saying, Tim, well, that actually should have a lot to do with a difference between the two battles, but in terms of troop strength, the discrepancy between Northern and Southern armies is relatively the same. Sure, you can say that the Army of Virginia outnumbers Stonewall Jackson and his troops, and generally the Union Army is able to bring more men to the field as a whole, but I would kind of discount it for the reason that when all is said and done, the total troop strength of the armies is 50,000 Confederates compared to 62,000 Union engaged. Compare that to the 35,000 Confederates versus 36,000 Union troops engaged for First Bull Run. I think these figures are sort of comparable, and then factor in that in the beginning of the engagement, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard is also outnumbered and needs to wait for the bulk of Joseph E. Johnston's Shenandoah army to arrive so that he can come close to parity. Think about that also in terms of the fact that while Jackson is isolated, he needs to wait for Longstreet's command, and Lee needs to combine his forces in order to have his full army present before he can really conduct his offensive operations, right? So it's actually a very similar situation that they find themselves in. Different, but similar enough, in my mind, to when we were making a comparison that discrepancy in troop strength when it comes to Civil War armies is really not too much of a major difference. You can even bring in the similarity that there is a portion of the Union Army that is being held back for some reason, being that part in 1861 of Patterson, or the reserves versus in 1862 McClellan is very slowly filtering in the Army of the Potomac reinforcements. There's also kind of a similarity in that, right? Now, then you could also have your argument, and I don't want to necessarily open this can of worms of whether you think that George B. McClellan is intentionally dragging his feet and he really wants Pope to fail, and that's why he is withholding these troops, and whether you think that Patterson is really to blame or whether it's just a kind of a perfect storm of the circumstances that really leads to the fact that he can't pin down Johnson in the Valley, and whose fault exactly is it that that portion of the operation fails. And whether also we can point a finger at the fact that Irvin McDowell doesn't really do anything with his left flank during the battle, who knows, right? We have a lot of open-ended questions there. But my point is that even though the armies are larger in 1862, strictly from a numerical point of view, we can label this as a non-factor for our exercise today. Secondly, and probably important to some, while the terrain is generally the same, as we mentioned, the battlefield orientation is also different. Now, this is another one where you could be like, well, this is actually a huge difference, but I will discount it slightly as the campaign scenario rolls out a little differently, where the army orientations create the lines at different angles. For instance, at First Manassas, as the battle unfolds, generally the Confederate line is along Bull Run, the Union flank attack comes down Matthews Hill, and then Henry House Hill, the Confederates make their stand and repulse the Union troops back the way they come. Second Manassas, the shared ground has the Union troops actually defending Henry House Hill, but receiving the attack not from Matthews Hill, but rather from Chen Ridge, so slightly different of a direction. Now, it is fair to say most of the action in 1862 is happening along the unfinished railroad cut, as that sees battle on the second day, or first day proper, however you look at it, and then again on the final day as well. Then you have Longstreet's flanking attack that will sweep the Union forces and seek the action to move into the first day's battlefield. Had there been no flank attack, then we might not have seen a whole lot in terms of shared ground, and we might have had two very separate battles. So then, is it actually worth calling out that the orientation of the two armies is actually different? Yes. Stonewall has his men facing relatively south, Longstreet is coming from the west. The defense of Henry House Hill is from the Union perspective, this time not the Confederate, but oddly enough, there are still the ones retreating across Bull Run, so there's a little bit of confusion there. Calling it out is important for sure, but also doesn't necessarily impact what I'm trying to accomplish in this exercise. Not really. There is similar terrain in the Confederate assault on Chen Ridge that hindered the Union assault in 1861. The same obstacle hinders their pursuit of the army. We will call it the railroad cut as the unique feature in 1862, but again, this is the sole unique feature when it comes to what we're talking about today. We will move into the realm of similarities. In a general sense of objectives and tactics, we will see more or less a lot of similarities between the two battles. This is really not a whole lot of difference when it comes to thinking about battlefield logic between 1861 versus 1862 in broad strikes. General officers are going to use the same battlefield tactics with some minor tweaks. Flanking attempts are important and are going to be main themes of both battles. Obviously, we have the situation sort of flipped, where in 1861 the Union Army is launching a flank attack, whereas the Confederates are successfully rolling the Union flank in 1862, with some situational difference. In 1861, we have Beauregard with his abortive attempt on the Union left flank. We know that some brigades even advanced beyond Bull Run in this effort before being forced to shift to meet the threat developing on Matthews Hill. McDowell, to his credit, did indeed throw his army into a successful move to the rebel flank and could probably have won the battle for the North. Loosely, we can compare this where both in the center is checked where there is an open flank. This is a usual tactic. Both in 1861 and 1862 actually also have bolder flanking maneuvers as well, but I want to touch on that a little later. It is actually pretty easy to compare, and I find a major similarity in the Union objectives before both battles. In both cases, the primary field leaders are trying to get at the Confederates in a general sense. McDowell reluctantly, while Pope is a more boastful kind of guy. Obviously, if you have listened to my Pope versus Burnside episode, you know I'm not really a big Pope guy. Sorry if you're listening to this and you're more on his side, but I don't think you're going to find me being too easy on him in this episode either. As such, this is going to be harder to measure, but I believe that both are going to be outside of their depth when it comes to overall Army command. Pressure to get something underway is going to spur Irvin McDowell into action in 1861, and he will at least paper develop a plan that might have been pretty good. For a variety of reasons, his plan is going to unravel. But find and engage is going to be the mission, and spurred by the administration, which is needed to have some sort of action to try to stamp out the rebellion. Pope's appointment is also spurred by the administration and is a direct response to McClellan and his case of the slows. Having had all the momentum in the spring and early summer of 1862, an aggressive action to bring the rebels to heel in the main theater of the war was what motivated Pope's moves, including his famous address and his potential treatment of civilians. Confederate objectives are slightly different, but also in a general sense, we can summarize them and keep the war in Northern Virginia. Obviously, in 1861, they're already there, so operating defensively at first, building up the army, and then potentially acting offensively is on the table. 1862, we have the battles around Richmond. Check Pope and his Army of Virginia, make sure McClellan truly is evacuating the peninsula, and then move the war back away from Richmond, which had been threatened since the spring, is on the table. So similar objectives. The Confederacy also was in need of victories in both 1861 and 1862 to continue to establish legitimacy, ironically, on the same ground. Something perhaps that we failed to mention or failed to talk about as often is that a victory for both sides in both situations is going to give flexibility. For the Union, for First Manassas, if they had won at First Bull Run, it would give them flexibility for a move, possibly down to Richmond. And then, what's next after that? Where are we going from there? Is the rebellion going to be over? Who knows, right? If Pope is able to win at Second Manassas, again, we're probably moving down to Richmond. And then what happens from there, right? Where are we going to move from there? So it kind of gives you, probably Richmond is next, but it is going to give you the flexibility to then move, right? And in terms of the Confederate sense, in both cases, it does give you flexibility. Now, for First Manassas, Johnson kind of sits there after his victory, so he doesn't really capitalize. He doesn't really do a whole lot, even though you have guys like Stonewall Jackson who are like, let's go to Philadelphia, let's burn it down, like let's go into DC, let's go ahead and burn that down, right? I can get in there, give me some men. You have guys who want to do something after the victory, but at least it does give you the kind of the flexibility of, we need to decide what to do. This kind of offensive defensive strategy that we're going to unroll that ultimately doesn't work, right? Second Manassas is also eventually going to give you that flexibility. Lee convinces Jefferson Davis, and a lot of what we talk about and kind of mention is that Lee is able to manage Davis very well, and he is going to have this idea to go into Maryland. He has the flexibility to do that after the victory, so it's one of the things that we need to mention. We'll move into common differences. A big difference, I think, is a common between both armies in troop experience. I want to flick back to the flank attack that is launched in 1862 compared to 1861. We can even maybe postulate on the attempt of Porter on the final day in 1862 to turn the flank of Jackson, if you recall. Pope has an intelligence gaffe in that he is unaware of Longstreet fully formed in a position to roll him up in this case. My point here is, as mentioned earlier, in McDowell's move, in Longstreet's move, even in Porter's move. All these are bolder flanking attempts in 1862 compared to 1861. We can probably break down the Union battle plan in 1861 simply that it was too complex and allowed for too much movement, too much time, and not enough troops on the right side of Bull Run at the right time to capitalize on any gains. Could the 1862 armies have pulled this off? Well, I think the experience level in the average soldier and officer alike is closer than maybe we think. I also think the amount of gained knowledge is something that would have allowed for more opportunity. This might not be too crazy to say after a winter of army building, the 7 days, including the peninsula thrown in there, and the campaign leading up, but also, on paper, it's not really a whole lot. Keep in mind that when we get to Second Manassas, right, and I don't necessarily think I have to point this out to you guys, but We don't really have Antietam. We haven't had Gettysburg. We haven't had a lot of these other battles yet. So we don't have that experience yet. During the 7 days, you still have friendly fire incidents, so we are not too far removed from that. We also have evolved slightly out of small unit tactics that defined the combat in 1861. Brigade action would define battles as opposed to individual regiments moving into combat, which would still happen, but it's not as common. The Bronner Farm fight is probably closer to the 1861 battle and those tactics, in that it is indeed a smaller unit action, a soldier's fight from a very close range. Obviously, there is a correlation with larger armies, but also you can imagine if you have more men in column, then more confidence, whereas smaller groups attacking might waver. The Bronner Farm fight is especially interesting as well because they are so very close. You get to that particular part of the battlefield and you realize just how close they were. And this is just straight out of Napoleonic, handbook almost, right? And so you still see that even in the 1862 battle, even though there is kind of this experience upgrade between the 1861 and 1862 battle, you still have that as well, where it's kind of like you see the development, but also we still have that. It's like the page is turning almost, but we're not quite there yet. There's starting to be a different mentality when it comes to defensive positions as well. Even though the railroad cut is not the best defensive position, it does provide some cover, whereas in 1861, cover was not considered to be feasible on the battlefield. Likewise, attacking a defensive position is going to be accepted by infantry, whereas by, say, 1864, direct assaults on fixed positions is going to be phased out. I think it is not really a surprise that the parts of the Confederate line where the most success occurs for the Union on the second day are the spots where the cover is the least. We talked about this especially post-Overland campaign and into when we get to Petersburg, right? Especially, and I know that's very far in advance of the events that we're talking about today, but when you get to that point, the sides don't even try really to assault fixed positions. They just have no use for that anymore. It's not going to work. The troops, especially veteran troops, just refuse to do it. And you see just how that just goes out the window. Whereas earlier in the war, it's going to be seen kind of, and you can kind of lump that into maybe these kind of Victorian ideals that we talk about before, kind of this sense of honor and bravery and, one more into the breach, right? Where we're going to go ahead and, over the top kind of, and I know that's World War I, right? But we're going to take this position and it's going to be glorious and whatnot. Well, obviously it is going to be seen as sort of foolhardy, and you'll see that there is going to be sort of this change in mentality. And we talked about this before in terms of how the psyche of your average soldier kind of changes and evolves as the war progresses. Possibly also part of troop experience could be supply and equipment. Both armies would have had better supplies in 1862, so I do not think this is going to be a groundbreaking observation, but I'm just saying. Some troops are wearing Revolutionary War uniforms in 1861. Some Confederates are armed with hunting rifles brought from home. Better armed, better trained would mean that the armies are better equipped to mass casualties on a greater scale, which of course we see the big difference in 1862 compared to 1861. One of the big fallouts from the Battle of First Manassas that gets talked about a lot is that there is a lot of war material that the Union Army leaves behind. They leave a lot of small arms, a lot of artillery pieces, whether it's on the battlefield itself or whether it is in the retreat afterwards, that the Confederate Army is then able to use, right? So had they not won the battle, that is also probably something that they would have had to kind of traverse, and it would have been a difficulty that the Army faces, whereas they have a lot of additional supplies a lot sooner. And there isn't not a major battle that really follows up First Manassas in 1861, at least not immediately, right? So they don't necessarily have to worry about it, but again, that is something that is often talked about as a fallout from First Manassas. Obviously, we have those leading the two armies as a common difference as well. More so for the Confederacy, there is a vast difference in capability from Lee versus Beauregard and Johnson, even though Jackson is there for both. I do not think I'm throwing shade on Beauregard when I say Lee has a better plan for 1862, as it is, in my opinion, Second Manassas being maybe his best battle, second only to Chancellorsville, although a lot of people say Chancellorsville is, in fact, his best battle. Johnson might not really be fair because he does relinquish operational control because he's not familiar with anything on the ground. Jackson is familiar with the terrain and does use it well, but Lee is able to use his trust in both his wing commanders and then his overall strategy to strike home a big victory for the South. Now, one thing that I do want to probably cover in a future episode, and we're going to talk about Beauregard just in general, because it's one of these guys who I also think is sort of a fascinating figure that gets talked about and kind of sprinkled in through our story, but it probably is worth maybe delving into at least, if not a full episode by himself, but maybe even a part of an episode. But he does actually have instances where he does a good job. And especially in 1864, he has these flashes of where you're like, oh man, Beauregard actually did something very well. And it is kind of easy to point at him and say, well, he's kind of an overrated guy. And it didn't take genius to be, lobbing shells at Fort Sumter. And that's really what you know him for, right? And you know him for this. And it is very Napoleonic how he is rolling things out. But you have to think about it, right? We just talked about the tactics and how they're very different and how we're really honing in on what we know. And we know is these very kind of outdated things that, again, it's a learning curve. We haven't learned yet. And we're having these huge flanking movements and these grand things that are not going to necessarily come to fruition. And Beauregard has his flanking attack that he's going to launch that ultimately probably would not have worked because he was attacking the Union left flank, which does contain probably some of the better troops within the army that are being withheld. And it would not have been necessarily an advantageous area to attack. And then he's able to then have to scramble and act defensively, and it does a pretty good job of that. But it is a far cry from being able to have the initiative, which is what Lee is always trying to have. He's always trying to have the initiative, right? For the Union Army, McDowell versus Pope is probably a closer comparison, even though McDowell, like Jackson, is actually present for both battles. Seemingly, McDowell does anything he can do to make sure he has no impact, and thus no blame in 1862, but that might be a whole different conversation entirely. Could you imagine having to try to revitalize your career on the site, perhaps your biggest failure? Probably not an easy job, but still. Pope is different than McDowell, in my opinion, though, in that, as I have mentioned before, McDowell does have a good, albeit intricate, battle plan. Pope likewise has a decent plan, but like McClellan, he does not do a good job of thinking in anything but a linear fashion. As the situation develops on the ground, he cannot deviate from his original plan of action. Trying to encircle Jackson at Manassas Junction before the battle proper is not a bad idea, but he is operating under the crazy assumption that Jackson is just going to wait patiently for him to be encircled. Seemingly, he is on the back foot ever since Stonewall punches him in the mouth at Cedar Mountain. Not that Cedar Mountain is a crushing Confederate victory, but a Southern win nonetheless. Pope has this kind of decision paralysis that's going to lead up to the battle. After the second day, he very much could have adjusted his battle plan to account for Longstreet's arrival, but instead he kind of just rolls out the same thing with Porter attacking and failing, which then opens up the opportunity for Longstreet to launch his assault. This again is very much a trait we see in those who fail to adjust to the situation on the ground, something that is sometimes common in generals early in the war. So now let's get into the differences, this one for the Union. A big difference in the Union battle plan is in its complexity. Now, we have already highlighted that in previous sections, and you're probably saying, well, Tim, you kind of just ran that down with Pope versus McDowell. Is the complex battle plan a positive or a negative? Does the battle plan have to be complex? Well, the short answer is if the battle plan works, then it is the right one. Could Pope have defeated Jackson before Longstreet gets through Thoroughfare Gap? Alternately, could Pope have checked Lee and Longstreet at Thoroughfare Gap before Jackson could react? That might have been a more complex operation, but it had the potential to trap Jackson on the right side of a mountain in between the Army of Virginia and the converging Army of the Potomac. Basically, I think that Second Manassas has more options for Pope prior to the actual engagement. Once engaged, we have limited options. Attacking Jackson and his isolated part of the army is probably the right call, but then again, we need to account for Longstreet's arrival. McDowell probably has a better plan for success on the field of battle itself, but it's hard to say. I do not think it's too crazy to say that both are facing superior generalship. It is hard to evaluate that McDowell had better intelligence, but it's also hard to imagine that he would have interpreted what was happening around him worse than John Pope on the second day in 1862, which I think is another big difference when it comes to the plan and how things roll out. McDowell is kind of partly to blame because, once again, he fails to give Pope the crucial bit of information that Longstreet had made it through Thoroughfare Gap. But Pope is seemingly not going to believe battle reports, or maybe he misunderstands their meaning. Even the successes are going to be sort of a mystery to him. Phil Kearny of Heintzelman's 3rd Corps and James Nagle of Reno's division of the 9th Corps would both see success in attacking Jackson, but in both cases the Confederates would retire and rally and drive off the enemy. Pope was convinced that if the rebels stood, they were near breaking, and they would probably be retiring to the mountains. Hatch's brigade, which was talked about when we went over the 14th Brooklyn, had run into Longstreet's command at Groveton and suffered fairly heavy casualties. And Reynolds reported large amounts of Confederates and artillery massing in his front. To Reynolds and McDowell's command, Pope would respond that he was an excitable young man. Could McDowell have stepped in and backed up Reynolds? Possibly. Is Second Manassas also McDowell's fault? I don't think so, but he certainly does not do a good job. Pope's failure in evaluation does really go back to his inexperience in command, which he talked about in the beginning of how both field commands in 1861 and 1862 are probably outclassed and really not the right guys for the job. Now, are guys like Grant and Sherman winning Second Manassas at this point in the war? It's hard to say, but I think that they would have done a better job of understanding the situation as it was unfolding. So a similarity is actually that Union reinforcements are withheld in both 1861 and 1862, but the reason as to why they're withheld is very different. We can kind of say that Patterson and his army in the valley do not do their job, and we can classify them as reinforcement. They could have done a better job in holding down Johnson, but as we have highlighted in our Redux episode for First Manassas, there are a variety of problems that are facing him and his force, including expiring enlistments. There is a reserve force that kind of remains in place in 1861 that probably would have been better used on the field as well. In 1862, it is not so much in the fellow army failing, if you think Patterson does not do a good job, as he might have just gambled on throwing his army into a campaign and maybe banked on his soldiers remaining in the field, as opposed to just walking away, but in the reassignment of the Army of the Potomac. There is a lot of people who point to McClellan and his intentional dragging of his feet when it comes to relocating the army to Northern Virginia. Famously, is his quote about how Pope is facing Jackson and how he's essentially going to learn about what that's like. He's sort of rooting for him to fail in that situation, perhaps. And those who are softer on McClellan will just point out that the humanity of his situation and that he's being benched for Pope, and that it is natural that he would want his replacement to not have the easiest of times. However, I have also seen it pretty well accepted that he does delay a lot of the potential moves for the Corps in his army. If Pope had more troops available to him earlier, then things might have been different. On the second day in particular, if he had more men to exploit a breakthrough, then that drastically changes the battle. Now, logistically, could the entire Army of the Potomac been at his disposal by the time the battle is underway? This is kind of hard to say, right? Because McClellan does have to withdraw his men from the peninsula. He's still sort of in the face of Confederates when he's withdrawing his troops. So he can't just go ahead and just get them all into the boats and get them up there, right? So there is that. And there are some logistical problems in getting the troops out to Pope where he is. So you could say that there are problems there that aren't necessarily McClellan's fault, or things that are outside of his control at least. And not necessarily for nothing, there are some people that kind of talk like or write in these sources that I've seen that kind of have it as a foregone conclusion that if there were an additional corps, say, on the field for John Pope, that he would have just won Second Manassas. And it's kind of like, we can just take that as a fact and, not say that it wouldn't have happened. Like, maybe like the Fifth Corps kind of gets not utilized at all, on the second day, right? Like maybe they don't even see action at all. Or maybe there are additional troops that are thrown into action. Who knows, right? It's really hard to say had there been an additional corps or divisions, who knows? So I don't necessarily think that we can just go ahead and chalk that up as Pope does a better job if he has any kind of additional troops sooner than he does. But it doesn't hurt to have more men on hand than what he has at the beginning of the battle, right? Now here are some differences from the Confederate side. From the Confederate perspective, First Bull Run is dominated by the fact that it's a reaction battle where McDowell and the Union forces definitely seize the initial advantage, and the Southern troops are forced to scramble and meet the threats. Therefore, for untrained troops, this is going to be a better kind of engagement where there is a less offensive work to do. Defensive action is usually better than offensive in these cases. Still, Jackson is able to act on the defensive, actually in both cases, although in the Bronner Farm portion of the fighting, he does fall on the Union column, acting offensively. Artillery on full display all 3 days will also punctuate the Confederate efforts. Whereas on the back foot, and forced to really be dictated to by the Northern troops in 1862, there is going to be the sense that even when acting defensively, there is more of the initiative on the side of the Confederates on all 3 days. I know that is kind of hard to believe, given on the second day Jackson is really just holding on until Longstreet is able to get into position where the rebels can launch their attack for the final day of combat. Obviously, though, there lies the big difference in that there is an overall plan, but as things develop on the ground, there will be changes to that plan that will be on display. As Jackson fights his battle, then Longstreet and Lee will arrive and set up their plan of attack. It's hard to imagine that this was the plan from the outset of the campaign, but obviously opportunities will arise as the action unfolds, so it's up to the general officers to evaluate and adapt. It's easy to also imagine that things might have gone in opposite directions. The Union attacks on the final day happen in the later afternoon. This requires a lot of waiting on the part of the Confederates. Pope was not necessarily incorrect, and the troops under Jackson had been fighting for 2 days, some of them, and marching, and thus pretty well spent. So hanging on was going to be an issue, and pursuit for some of them was going to be lackluster. Contact having been made on the previous day might have even made an attack on the final day impossible. Massed artillery and Stephen D. Lee would support Jackson in repulsing Porter, who would get the blame from Pope for the defeat famously before Longstreet launches his famous attack, including Hood's decimation of the 5th New York. The timely defense of Chinn Ridge and Doan's Ridge would allow for a final line to protect the army at Henry House Hill. Obviously, you do not really see a major offensive concentration in 1861, so 1862 is a little different in this regard. This leads us to our final point when it comes to the 1862 battle, and one that I think attempts to rectify a major criticism of the 1861 engagement. 1862 sees a renewed effort to capitalize fully on Napoleon on the destruction of the Union field armies. Now they will be able to escape from the field, getting to Centerville, Franklin's Corps arriving to bolster the defense, but we see cavalry this time more than just Stuart's command trying to drive home their victory. They will engage against Buford amongst other Federal horsemen. A change in the contemporary view on cavalry had occurred in the brief year between the two battles. Obviously, there was not a whole lot of stock in them in 1861. In 1862, obviously, we see the value in cavalry for intelligence and screening purposes. The 1862 battle cavalry plays a major role for the rebels in helping to screen Longstreet in his advance. But they will try to drive home the victory and meet enough resistance to be stopped. Infantry too will pursue, but they will fail in the attempt due to the defensive line set up on the hill. And again, you can also even point to the Battle of Chantilly that happens afterwards, as there's kind of this follow-up attempt to try to capitalize on the victory. That did not happen at First Manassas, right? Jackson trying to rectify the wrongs of First Manassas. Once again, remember, he's the one that's advocating, give me, a couple thousand men and I can get into the capital, I can get into DC, I can capture it. Well, he is saying, if you have this flanking, once again, a flanking maneuver, I can cut off part of this army. We can really drive home this victory. It doesn't work out at Chantilly, right? And you can see that kind of follow-up action where you really didn't have anything. And part of that also is that the army was not in a place at all to have this kind of pursuit following the 1861 battle. Maybe that's training, generalship, what have you, but obviously that is a major difference between the two battles. So what did we learn between 1861 and 1862? What is the main takeaway here? Well, tactics have changed. Leadership is different, and I think experience really drives the style of this difference. Some of this stuff is situational, sure. But the overall question, I guess, we are trying to answer, is it more different than it is the same? Overall, you have to say yes, which maybe is not so much of a surprise, but I find myself saying yes by not that much. The arguments for the differences are more compelling, and there are probably more of them, so that's really what it comes down to. But especially from the Union side, you find yourself saying, well, this is a difference, but also a similarity as well, which is kind of the interesting thing I found in this exercise, and hopefully you found it interesting as well. So we're going to go ahead and stop right there. Maybe you have a better appreciation for First versus Second Manassas in this different type of episode. Maybe perhaps you have your own opinion about First versus Second Manassas. I don't think this is by any means a comprehensive list of everything. These are just some general thoughts on the matter and just an interesting look, I think, in two battles that maybe seem like they're very far apart but are actually a little bit closer together. Next time, we will be dialing back the clock a bit. We have talked about how we need to maybe go back and look at the beginning of the conflict. So we will be taking a look at the early days of 1861 and before. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Once again, feedback is welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening and have a great week.